Welcome to Nacht Waffen Pilot with Penny Bradley. And today, my guest is the great Walter Bosley, investigator of historical occult mysteries, author of pulp fiction novels, and a screenwriter who has appeared on the History Channel's Ancient Aliens. After 19 years in national security, uh, I think we call that three letter groups. Walter Bosley runs his small press publishing company, Lost Continent Library, founded in 2002. Bosley has traveled much of the world, both on the job and off, including ancient site trips through Mexico and South America. He has been employed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, is an inactive reserve officer in the U.S. Air Force, for which he served as a special agent of the AFOSI while on active duty, and then worked as a counterterrorism operational consultant for 6 years following military service. Bosley spends his time writing fiction and nonfiction, as well as investigating strange mysteries. Bosley's books are sold exclusively through lulu.com. Welcome.
Hey, it's good to be here, Penny. Thanks for having me on. I look forward to this.
I was really pleased when you accepted my friend request on Facebook, and I sent you one of my overly self-conscious and cryptic invitations to be on the show. Daryl had our producer here has informed me that people now know who I am, so I can stop being self-conscious on invitations. So, knowing what I usually talk about when it's just me, I'm not sure that's a good thing, but it's okay. Anyway, I have listened to a great many of your videos on YouTube, and you impressed the hell out of me.
So, thank you.
So, I'm being honest and straightforward. I'm hoping that somewhere in today's 2-hour approximately show that we can talk about the Sonora Aero Club and the great airship mystery that followed it, and the group that funded both of those things. And I binge read your trilogy about the Empire of the Wheel. So I'm sure that will come up. So,
well, with where you live, we're definitely going to talk about that subject. You're right there in the heart of it. So
yeah, most of the Sonora Aero Club was actually done in Colombia, and that was where I met my partner. You will occasionally hear his voice in the background. We do have a green screen up because people were bitching about what he was doing while I was on air.
I started using the backdrop because, during COVID year, it was okay. Everybody was doing stuff from home. But once I got into this year, I decided, you know what? It's not that year anymore. It's time to get back to, looking a little bit normal. So I started throwing behind me this backdrop as well because the room is a mess.
Yeah, well, we live in a small townhouse, and it's Lou and I and 2 cats, and sometimes the cat will climb up on the chair during.
And steal the show, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. But, I live in Tuolumne County, California, which is where the Sonora Aero Club was located. And I live approximately 2 miles from the Rosasco Ranch.
Ah,
And that
okay.
Frank Rosasco was mentioned in your
Mhm.
series.
So
And
you're close to the Don Pedro Lake Reservoir, right?
yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. In fact, last weekend was the weekend, right? There were shooting incidents, and it was described in the local media that one of the parks where you can go have lunch at Lake Don Pedro, that there was a shootout between 5 people.
Oh my God. What
um,
was I never would expect that in that area. Is there something
oh my
I don't
God,
know about that area?
you don't know about us?
No.
I refer to this area as Redneckville, bumfuck, California.
Oh no.
It is as close to Tennessee as you can get this side of the Rockies.
Oh my God.
We have two militia groups, one's Satanist and one's Christian. And either one of them come into town and the sheriff's department is, hello, sir, step aside for them. Yeah, so that's where I live.
That's interesting. Wow. I mean, I've done 2 trips up there, since 2013 for research and such. And I did, a fun video on one of those visits. And I never would have, I mean, yeah, it kind of being out for California, it's out in the countryside, but that's kind of an appealing way. I never would have imagined that there was some, hardcore serious
There's
guys out
hardcore,
there like that.
there's hardcore serious shit here.
Oh
And
wow.
the Russian mafia drops their bodies into Lake Maloney's, and
Wow.
every time the water level gets down a bit, we start finding body parts on the shores of all the lakes. And
Wow.
the joke here is, if you don't like somebody, they'll end up in the bottom of a mine shaft, and there are plenty of them.
Plenty of those. Yeah, that's gold country.
And we have the population is like half retirees from the Bay Area and LA, and they are completely and totally oblivious to all of this.
As they
It,
would be. Yeah.
it's the locals.
Well,
And
yeah, just as a visitor up there, I was oblivious to it. I didn't know. I had no idea of the present dynamic of things up there. That's very enlightening.
we
So
also have a group. I don't know if you know Peter Moon, but he was intrigued with them. This group is called Eclampus Vitus.
oh yeah, yeah, oh yes,
And
ECV. Mm.
um, my partner's 2 daughters are both married to members.
ECV, what I run into with them is, of course, we have a couple of their markers down here at sites, a
Yeah.
prominent one being at the Integratron. But what I run into is there are some people, in the research community that when you look into these little California mysteries and enigmas, their knee jerk is to say, "Oh, that's all ECV. It's not real." I know that they like to, have a little fun, in their history, with stuff, but no, not everything is generated by Eclampus Vitus.
No,
But
they're primarily a men's drinking club,
right, yeah,
and their secondary purpose is the monuments that you talked about. And
yeah, which is pretty cool.
it is. It's very
it
cool.
memorializes fascinating places and things.
And
So,
the son-in-laws have described some of their initiations, where that they had this poor guy blindfolded and underneath a potty seat, and they, a child's training toilet, and
yeah.
they were feeding him chocolate pudding.
Oh my God.
This is kind of stuff they do.
And
people think this group is some great secret society.
And even when you know you're being fooled with, the fact that you got the blindfold on, it's just the the sense, the sensation experience. It just kind of that's funny. Oh, those nutty guys.
The guy I live with, we were both working at the local limestone quarry. I was the janitor and he was the security guard, and that's how we met. So that's down this long dirt road. Well, it's gravel now, but it's on the Stanislaus River, overlooking it, and there used to be a mountain there. Now there's a big hole.
We have we have a out here. It was called Mount Sloan Mountain, or I can't remember the name now. But all my life is because I spent much of my life here. Even though we would move away a couple of times, we would come back, and then even though I was all over the country in places in my job, I still came back, and there was this this mountain that was there all my life, through childhood, through high school, and in college, and then they were mining it for lime and rock and stuff for cement, for the cement plants, and it was just for decades. This was and they're still doing it, but they finally, the mountain disappeared and they reached ground level probably about 15 years ago. So it's kind of weird when my memory as a kid, that mountain was always there, and for the last 10 or 15 years it's gone. Now they're digging into the ground.
That's what's going on here. Is Blue Mountain is no longer, and it's now a open pit mine, and it's huge, and the company mostly makes a product they call flour, and it's used in the production of glass. They also have a gravel that they use for Superfund sites. You dump dolomite or limestone gravel into the acid, and it will dissolve and neutralize the acid as it dissolves. And it only dissolves until the acid is used up. So at that point, it's chemically neutral and safe. So it's one of the better products out there. So I have good feelings about having worked there for 13 years.
There you go.
So, that's what you do when you go to college and you don't get to graduate because you had an illness. You find something else to do and hope that it's interesting.
Yeah.
So, in the stuff that I've heard you talk about, Sonora Aero Club, you mentioned a Mr. Delshow. And I've seen, we may hear train whistles in the background. I
thought that's what that was.
I live very close to Railtown.
I love it because I love trains. I love rail travel. So that of all the sounds, I'd much rather hear that train whistle than a fire truck or a police or ambulance siren in the background.
We may get those too.
Okay, but the train whistle, I love that. What you need to do is have that recorded so that he can hit that train whistle once in a while in there on the board, right?
Would you like that, Daryl? Okay, yeah. I'll work on doing that then.
That's a cool sound.
So
that's our backyard.
Yeah, that's behind the backyard. There's a chain link fence in the way that I found one day when I was walking home down the train tracks. And yes, I'm one of those people. So I was going to ask you if you knew what year approximately that the Sonora Aero Club formed?
Well, the one source we have on the Sonora Aero Club, original source, is Charles Delschow, the German immigrant who, according to his story, he came to the United States in the mid 1850s, specifically in the employ of the mysterious group NYMZA, which we'll talk about, to report, to observe openly, not secretly, openly go visit the Sonora Aero Club, observe, and then report back to NYMZA, you know, their progress and what they were doing. And it seems to me, you know, Delschow talks about them being in California for, you know, already established. So my basic understanding is it's 1855, 1856 that Delschow visits them, and they had been in California already. So I think it's no earlier than 1850, 1851. And by 1859, you know, or maybe even 58, they had dissolved because Peter Menace got killed, relative, we are told, relative to an accident with one of the arrows. So other than Delschow, the only thing that would be close to a record of the existence of the Sonora Aero Club is the fact that there are some family names that still, you can still find in Columbia and Jamestown and around that area today. So it's kind of, yeah, it's kind of thin if you cut Delschow out of it. Yeah. But you would expect that, you know, with the nature of the group and what they were doing. Now, the other clue that I have found through my work is, and I have to thank Stephen Romano, the guy who put together and published through his gallery the amazing book titled The Art of Delschow. If you haven't seen this book, it's a large oversized book with wonderful, colorful plates. It's about like 2 inches thick, and it's a big oversized book. And in one of the plates there is shown one of Delschau's drawings done between 1899 and 1923, what is essentially the same technology, only in rudimentary proof of concept form as what we know as Die Glocke, the Nazi bell. And you know, so through my research, and I've pointed that out and tried to show the line of connection, because what is the central through line here? This was a group of Germans, right? German immigrants that we are told were backed by an organization that was headquartered in Germany. And then, you know, less than 100 years later, we have another German organization, essentially the Nazi war machine, that looks like they were developing some of the same technology that this group in the 1850s was doing. So, you know, that's kind of the hypothetical, you know, the idea is that that's really where the Nazi scientists and technicians got the idea for the bell, is that it was something that people they were involved in. And I dare say that NYMZA, if it truly existed, was probably one of the driving forces of the rise of Nazi Germany. And again, I think through these sources, that's how Die Glocke happened, not from some captured alien saucer that they reverse engineered, which I know a lot of people just love and adore that story, but there's so many more reasons to look at other possibilities for where they would have got the idea for this.
The repulsina had to come from somewhere.
What's that?
The repulsina had to come from somewhere. Schauberger's engine.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I've heard stories that Schauberger was given the plans from Maria Orsic, that she had channeled them. But it makes much more sense to me that the core design of the Glocke was two spirals opposing each other, and that the fuel was mercury based, but that it had something else in it to keep it from transmuting into gold.
That would be, well, and think about what we're told about the Sonora Aero Club with Peter Menace and this mysterious, liquid based stuff he would use called the soup. It was this green colored stuff, and the application of that in the motor that he had designed for the Aeros resulted in, what we would call an anti-gravity effect. And, you have Delschau writing this between 1899 and 1923, he's writing about this stuff, and he dies in 1923, which is at the very least 10 years before any of the Nazis would have been working on the Glocke, right? So
yeah, but it's the right time frame for Schauberger to be working on the Repulsina.
Right, because he started working on that in the 1920s, correct?
Yes, and he was in the Tula. So they were who is credited with putting the Nazis forward. Whether they were the actual power that did it or not is still very mysterious.
I think when people to the whole thing about the Nazis captured some down saucer and did reverse engineering, what that's doing is completely disregarding centuries of these hermeticists and alchemists and philosopher scientists that were pursuing even ancient concepts in what we would call exotic technologies, and were certainly exotic for their day. And they had been doing this for centuries. So it's much more likely that very human sources, human researchers had made discoveries and developed what they had discovered in a logical thread through history that would lead to De Glocke. And this is much more likely, but not just much more realistic, but much more likely than some, reverse engineered alien saucer. Not that I don't believe in extraterrestrials, I absolutely do, but they don't explain everything that people think they explain, as fun as that is and as popular as that is.
I've been doing my own where did it come from on Earth kind of research. And the earliest I can track any of the technology is Sir John Dee, and that would be Elizabethan era. So, and he didn't have an engine put together, but he was exploring the concepts. And when he and Edward Kelly broke up, Edward ended up in Bohemia, which today is the Czech Republic, but there was an in-between time when it was part of Austria. And Austria and Prussia, they may not have been best buddies, but they got along better with each other than they did with any of the English-speaking peoples. So I'm figuring in my research that Edward Kelly is the source of it. But a lot of what he was doing is exactly what we today would call channeling, which really bothers me.
Oh yeah, I have an issue with channeling. Again, well, here's so that people, who's this Walter Bosley guy? What does he actually think about stuff? I'm one of those folks who I certainly, like I said, I'm personally convinced. I definitely think there are intelligent ET civilizations out there that can traverse space, that have come to this planet and continue to come to this planet. However, I don't think everything that gets popularly explained by extraterrestrials no. The majority of that can be explained by other things. The same thing with what we call psychic abilities and practices like channeling and stuff. I certainly think all these things are real. The problem we have in our times, and for a long time it's been this way. There's too many, frauds in the mix who are more than willing, so what we have to do is, and I'm speaking in a general sense, what we have to do is use discernment and for ourselves decide, who we think has credibility and who doesn't. And, one thing I think that really needs to stop is there's been this habit, this practice of, well, if you yourself research curious things, right, or extraordinary phenomena or strange stuff, you can't be critical of any other claims of such. If you're going to talk about the stuff, research the stuff, then therefore you have to respect everybody else's hypotheses. And I disagree with that, because when something is clearly or upon examination shown to be not true, shown to be BS, I think it's up to us who are legitimately and sincerely trying to investigate and present, more credible instances of this. I think it's up to us to speak out and say, no, you don't get to waste the time of maybe some other researcher who's doing something legitimate with your crazy stories and such. And I think that this would help our community and this research out a lot if maybe we all, us and the audience, just go ahead and use that discernment. If something just doesn't seem legit to you, then throw that flag, and say, hey, this, I don't know about this. And anyway, that's where I'm coming from. That's where I'm at is I do think it's very important to do some critical thinking. Now, that's probably the professional investigator in me, right?
Yeah.
Because it's evidence-based and whatever, at least try to find evidence for something and be sincere and legitimate and don't make up stories. And, so that's where I'm at. So when you hear me being critical, that's where I'm coming from.
The real problem in my community is because they tend to take dreams as face value facts. And that's very dangerous territory.
Mm-hmm.
And most dreams are not memories. Most dreams are your mind processing things, and it's very symbolic language. And it has more to do with what you watched on YouTube or Netflix than it does with your distant past. And trying to tell people you're dreaming about this because you're listening to this on YouTube is not a particularly popular notion.
Right. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
And with the folks that I deal with, I have a rule of thumb. If it's not possible in 3D reality, and you don't have a legit 3D technology to explain it, then you're probably pulling it out of your ass.
Oh, yeah. There's something to that.
This has offended a great many people.
Yeah, it does. It does. What you get too are people who they don't want to really be forthcoming on something that's just a speculation or hypothesis, because they think that makes them look less confident. And, they want to convince, an audience or readers that they know what's going on. So of course they're not going to say, hey, I think this, I could be wrong. Now I make it a point to say that as much as possible when I'm just talking about speculations.
You've said that a lot. Okay, guys, I have read his trilogy, The Empire of the Wheel, and it's worth reading. And he says that a lot in it, that this may just be speculation. And he starts off with questions and he ends up at the end saying, okay, we still have more questions than answers. Now, a lot of his hypotheses made perfect sense to me. But then I've been exploring all kinds of weird things since a pair of NSA agents decided to use my Remember code on me in 2013. So, and that's all I'm going to say about that. I've explored a lot of weird topics. So, we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about Mr. Bosley.
Or to talk with me about other things.
Yes. So, the next question I had is, do you have any clue what the green stuff was?
Well, it's more that I've had other people make suggestions. One person made a very interesting suggestion. I believe he's an author who hasn't come out with a book yet or anything, so I don't want to identify him. Okay. He's working on something right now, and he's got a really interesting line of research. But he has proposed that it might have something to do with the substance of the actual emerald tablet. Okay, that or some type of crystalline, whatever would be literally green, because Del Shao tells us it was green. Now, I have made a recent historical discovery, and when I say discovery, I mean I have learned about it. I'm by no means the guy who dug this out of complete obscurity. But there was a guy who, I think his name's Racine, last name is Racine, and he's one of the founders of, the study of thermodynamics. Okay. With the other guy who's more famous. This guy, Racine, was right there with him when they founded this. And in 1849, he came out with a basic design concept for a turbine engine, which looks shockingly like Del Shao's drawings of what Peter Menace and the Sonora Aero Club were using in the Aeros, both before this bell-shaped thing and presumably after. And in fact, on my YouTube, in my little video about the Glocke, I show the schematic of the Racine turbine. And it really, it's remarkably, where it might be this element is up here and this one's down here in Racine. In, Del Shao's version of Menaces, he's got them flipped, but it's still obviously, in my opinion, what it means is, since Menace did not allegedly come out with this until into the 1850s, sometime before 1856, I would say, then I think he was definitely influenced by Racine. And what does that tell us? That means, of course, that Menace was a guy who was studying and up on what came to be known as, thermodynamics, and was clearly familiar with Racine's work, and in particular, this Racine turbine. And so
this would have been cutting edge science at the time.
Pardon?
This would have been cutting edge science at the time.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So if you take the Racine turbine, which is not supposed, you don't need some exotic fuel or liquid or whatever for the Racine turbine to work, but it looks like Menace applied some type of exotic, I don't know if you'd call it fuel, but some exotic liquid mix into the process, and it looks like he might have gotten that a result that even Racine didn't consider. In other words, I don't think Racine was looking at anti-gravity, but I think whatever this green soup was that Menace applied to, in my opinion, clearly a Racine turbine design, resulted in this. So we come back to the idea of the Mercury vortex. You know, was this the beginning? Did Menace see something in the Racine turbine, right, that inspired the idea of the bell shape? You know, and did he develop this the Glocke, the proof of concept rudimentary Glocke from the Racine turbine technology? And then again, we're talking guys that were into ancient knowledge. Did he get this idea of applying whatever this special stuff was, this soup was, to this modern, 19th century turbine? Did he get that idea from something in the ancient world? Now, people point to the Hindu scriptures and all that. The Ramayana does talk about some amazing technology, but not in such detail as people think. The book that often gets discredited,
written in
1908,
religious talk.
Yeah, but the book that specifically talks about the Vimanas and things with the designs, that actually is only dated to 1908. And this, of course, was, think about it, this was already 9 years after Delchau was writing his stuff. Yeah. So, Delchau clearly was not necessarily motivated by this book, because this particular 1908 book was not translated into English until 1952 or 3. And there's no sign that it was ever in German before that, and certainly not before Delchau died. So
I've been curious about what the green stuff was, because by the time the Nazis had it, they were using a red additive to the mercury.
Right. That's the story. Yeah.
Why the color change?
Well, think about it. If there was something about crystals and geodes and things like that in nature, what Menace could have been doing was could have been possibly using ground up emerald powder. Now we get to the Nazi era, and maybe they were using ground up rubies, actual ground up ruby powder of some sort mixed in with this mercury thing. So maybe there's something about that.
In this area, we have a rock that we call maripozite. And it's a green ore that's found in the same quartz crystal layers that the gold was found in.
There you go.
And it's copper based.
Okay, so that's a strong possibility, just because what you just said, it's present. It was right there for Menace to have access to, right? He would just have to mine it out.
This is pretty much the only place in the world that it's found is Tuolumne and Mariposa counties.
Even more reason to suspect that it was an ingredient of this supa, which now Delchau does explain kind of the basic breakdown of the recipe of the supa, but there is the element that remains unknown, and I think that's what we're talking about here. Is this whatever it is that makes it green? And what you see folks, there's the value of having somebody to who lives right there and knows the history even more than I can. I live 6 hours away, because I didn't know that. I hadn't dug into the mining history in depth, and so now I'll look at that more closely. That's really really good information. I haven't got into the really too deeply into the finer details of the technical aspects of it so much as I've been trying to do that historical thread, to try and determine, was Delchau telling the truth about this group, and then looking at the threads that may possibly connect it to things that we know and people we know were real in the 20th century, to kind of basically provide maybe some type of evidence that Delchau was telling the truth. And but it's when you dig into the technology that I found that you begin to find these threads that connect it to the 20th century. So it would be interesting.
I've been trying to track the technology that I was aware of to its logical foundations.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been working backwards from what I knew to be going on. And some of it has been very easy to track, and other parts have been very elusive. So
Yeah, definitely. There's some things that people didn't want found or learned.
yeah, that's probably the best way to put it. Is there are some things that people didn't want found, and one of the things that really worries me about the Aeros, I know the Glocke had serious radiation issues.
Mm-hmm.
Did the engines for the Aeros have that same problem?
You know what? I haven't thought so, only because remember the Nazi scientists, they incorporated the massive amounts of electricity into the mix, and I think that the exponential result of introducing electricity into this is likely what really caused the dangerous radiation. I think the way Menace was doing, and the guys of the Sonora Aero Club were doing it, if all this is true, was what you'd call probably the safe version of the idea, so to speak.
My partner went and got one of the chunks of mariposite that we have, and he wet it down.
Oh, wow. Okay, cool.
So
it's interesting how in front of that screen, he kind of appeared, he emerged out of space and to do that, like,
yeah.
like God coming in, here's the, and then he faded back. That was great.
Yeah, there it is.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's medium green, and you can see the quartz going through it.
And what's it called again?
Mariposite.
Oh, mariposite, like mariposa, mariposite.
Yeah, it's mariposite.
Oh, thank you so much, because that's a good lead.
This particular chunk doesn't have gold in it. Most of them do.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for telling me about that, because I'm going to, I'll dig into that, and I'll let you know what I find and bounce it off of you, because you probably have, a lot of great info that's, that I might not find anywhere else. So we'll see if between the two of us we can solve them.
I'm happy to help, because I'm trying to figure out, obviously the Repulsina wasn't the original engine, and it was a Twila device, and the device used by in the Aeros was so obviously the precursor to the Glocke. And so,
well, and the fact that they brought Schauberger into their fold, they kind of enlisted him, you might say.
You kind of draft people if they're good at something.
Yeah, and he was very much so, I think. So I agree with you. They drew. He had hit on something that was integral to the whole rotation dynamic of what was going on with the Glocke. So of course they yanked him in, pulled him in, and definitely I think he had his hands on that. Now he did, if I'm not mistaken, he did end up here for a while, right after the war.
I believe so.
So what does that suggest?
I know his son is back in Germany, but
what Schauberger being over here post-war, I personally look at Kecksburg as the big smoking gun that we definitely made our own attempt at developing the Glocke technology after the war. Personally, that's my personal take on Kecksburg. But it could have been
a lot of stuff that we've developed that was immediately put into Black Ops.
Oh yeah, of course.
The TR3 series of ships has their own anti-grav, and I believe that the B1 that
The
was
B2.
the B2
Yeah, the
had
B2 uses electrogravitics.
used an anti-grav to help give it lift.
Yeah.
So the technology is there. They're just finally now in the 21st century admitting to it.
Sort of.
Sort of.
They'll tell you, like, personally, I think letting the idea that the electrogravitic AG lift being on the B2, I'm surprised that they let that kind of be up in that public domain of information on the technology. That surprises me. I would have thought that there's things about the F-117 that for the longest time, very simple things that were integral to how the stealth works, that was the sensitive part. That was not the part that they wanted out. And the bit about the B2, that surprised me.
They didn't want it out that they were using a telepathic link with the pilot to fly it either.
I've heard that. Yeah, I've heard that.
So,
and it might have been some type of, well, I think it was technologically enhanced, right? It was through the helmet that the pilot wears.
My understanding is that here it's the helmet that the pilot uses. In the Black Ops, it's a chip that functions very much like Elon Musk's Neuralink project. So,
which he's not crazy about now, I guess, right? He's got an AI issue, not necessarily all of the stuff.
He's got an AI issue, but he's still funding the research.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So, but you know what? If his concern is sincere and legitimate, I would rather have a guy who sees the dangers and risk in something being the one involved with developing it, as opposed to some completely,
completely egotistical nutbag. Yes,
right.
That doesn't care what the effects of his
right
project are going to be. Yeah.
Right. Speaking about, you touched on something a few minutes ago, and we're talking about that area where you live, and particularly, people not really being close to vest about things and not wanting to talk about things. In my research, I had, as I mentioned in a couple of the books, I had spoken with, over the phone, Nathan Rosasco, who is a current living member of the Rosasco family, that has been there since the days of the Sonora Aero Club, and he and I were going to meet on my second trip up there. And what's interesting is, when we talked on the phone, I had called, we spoke briefly, then I called again, and we talked a little bit longer on the phone. And in that time between the first call and the second one, he had spoken with his mother and his dad or grandfather, somewhere, maybe it was his grandma he talked to. Anyway, the Rosasco patriarch had passed away, like he was in his 90s, like just months before I talked to Nathan. And so I wasn't able to talk to him, and he knew Frank. That patriarch knew Frank Rosasco. Well, the relative that Nathan spoke to also knew Frank. Okay. And so I was able to talk with, I was able to get, Nathan told me that when he went to talk to his mom or grandma, whichever it was, he said, hey, a guy, a researcher's asking about your Uncle Frank. And she said, oh, yeah. And she had mentioned him coming down to San Bernardino, and she had said he had lost his mind down there. And so, the things that she said to him confirmed the research and some of my guesses that I was making. But she was kind of half reticent to talk about it. And then when it came time for me to be up there and we were going to have lunch and meet, that didn't happen. And I have a feeling that maybe someone in the family said,
private people.
Yeah, it was like, no, we're not talking about this. Don't talk to that guy.
When I moved up here in 1990,
Uh-huh.
I tried to find work, and I had done home health care while I was going to college, because you can adjust the hours to what you need. So when I came here, I was doing home health care, and the widow of the patriarch at that point, so that would have been the parents of the patriarch you talked about.
Okay, so Nathan was probably talking to his mom then.
So I was talking to her,
Okay.
and she was one of these people at that point where she had been used to having servants, and you came in and she told you where to sit, and she gave you reading materials, and you were only to speak if spoken to. Her house is on the historical registry, and it's well maintained, and they're very private, and they act like rich people.
Mm-hmm.
But in the community, if you see them in town, if they recognize you, they'll say hi. But they're not going to talk anything of any importance, or anything that they would consider embarrassing them. And the mental illness of one of their elder members would be considered an embarrassment.
But and you're right. I totally see why and understand why. And yeah, Nathan was real nice guy, and his family that would answer the phone stuff, really nice. That I didn't get any kind of put offish, standoffish, negativity from them at all. It just simply, it was clear that he had spoken as much to me as he was going to, and as validating on some levels as that was, it was just clear that's like, that's all you're going to get, Mr. Bosley, and that was okay. That was, but I don't think, as you know, yeah, I don't think that. I think Frank obviously, had a temporary kind of breakdown and shock to his system while he was in San Bernardino. But the fact that he spent the remaining, 50 something years, 60 something years of his life doing those things, living on the ranch, never leaving. We're talking for about 60 years, the rest of this man's life. He's doing daily mathematical calculations, astronomical observations, and he's doing physical survey of something, some spot, something on the ranch property, that original ranch property. And as I state in my books and propose in my book, that is just so classically Lovecraftian, right? And I even say that in the books, that is Rosasco, where Lovecraft got the idea for his classic protagonist, right? The guy who is technically, scientifically adept, who sees the other side, and then for the rest of his life is on this mad quest to be in contact. What did he find is what I'm saying.
The description is your classic person whose worldview was completely destroyed.
Yes.
And didn't know how to rebuild a new one.
Right. And well, I think also he, in Frank's case, whatever this thing was that, as you point out, and describe aptly, that, completely changed his view. He was definitely onto something that was so intense that, again, to spend the rest of his life doing that, I don't think he was insane. I don't think there was
I don't think he was insane. I think he had run into that life crisis that destroys your worldview, and you're left with, you're crumbled, and nothing after that ever really makes you budge from it.
Right. Oh, of course. Yeah, I would agree with you. But on top of that, with that, there was this quest, that this data, whatever data he was collecting. I mean, think about it. The man had to have been documenting this stuff. Wouldn't it be great to see those documents, those journals?
That would have been fabulous. But knowing the pioneer families here, they probably burnt it all when he died.
They probably what?
Burnt it all.
Oh God, I would hope not. But you know, you have a point. You have a point. It would have been in the 70s. Well, it was in the 70s when he died. Early
That was
70s.
before I moved here, so
yeah, so we could always hope that there was a member of the younger generation that might have had the foresight to say, hey, wait a minute, we're going to hang on to this stuff. We just will never know. I don't think we'll ever know.
And who knows what he was hunting?
Pardon?
Who knows what he was hunting?
Exactly. That's what I'm fascinated with.
Was he looking for the telluric currents that
oh, I think he knew.
Well, you know, where I live,
yeah,
there is a crossing of ley lines not too terribly far from us. There's the one that comes from Montana, that's 11 miles straight south of me, and the one that goes down the middle of the state that's 23 miles the other way.
Now, I sent you, I shared with you data of the Secherie map that I have. Did I ever?
No.
Remind me to do that, because you're going to find that interesting.
What's it called? Google Earth Pro, and there is a download for that has ley lines.
Excellent. Okay, cool.
So that was what I used to map the distances. But
yeah, I'll share the data with you that I have.
Because I have no idea what the telluric flow is around here.
Oh, well, I can share that definitely with you, because my guy Secherie has done all that for me as early as 2009. He started doing this. 2008, he started doing this stuff for me. And at the old Rosasco Ranch, as you know, because I talk about it in the books, there's that intersection of multiple lines, which was on the Rosasco Ranch. And to answer your question, I think Frank definitely knew about that spot. I think he was already aware of that spot. I think what he was doing was measuring whatever phenomena that spot was manifesting, or he had some idea that something was connected to, or maybe even coming from space. I mean, that's where we're going here with Frank Rosasco. This man had to have
been sightings here going back into the Native American days.
Right.
There are petroglyphs in the area that they're either ETs or spirit beings, and the way they're drawn, it's hard to tell.
I kind of talk about that in my new book that I just released, by the way. In the last chapter, or the second to last chapter, I talk about the Miwoks and the missing 411 stuff in Yosemite, and how the stuff that predates the research David Paulides did connected with what the Miwoks mythology and what they believed was, you know, around there, and some of the instances pre the Paulides work. And so I'm with you there on that. I think that I would lean more towards spirit beings than extraterrestrials. In the book, I talk about this group, the Tuatha De Danann, that have a thematic link to some of these Miwok stories, and I go into that in the new book.
Okay.
A little bit.
Yeah, I tracked my family tree back to them. And that tells you what kind of family I'm from, if I'm able to do that.
There you go.
There are only so many families that they actually have records for.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's a fascinating resource to have.
So actually, once I made the connection between myself and a certain historical individual, I started being contacted by secret societies. So I would recommend that if you suspect that's in your tree, you keep your tree private. That's just a general safety thing.
Unless this is interesting. I've had for years this experience with my already mentioned associate Secherie, and also my good friend Joseph P. Farrell. And they each, separately, over the years, when I've researched stuff and looked into things, they each have said, oh, don't go there, don't do that, or you're getting into scary territory. And I tell them, I like to joke with them, it's like, hey, between us three, I'm the field guy, right? And having been a former federal agent, and what I used to do,
I'm
it was
not
part of my
saying
job.
don't do it. I'm saying take some precautions.
Right. Well, it's like I tell them, I say, I've had years of, that was part of my job, was to what I'm going to do is going to rustle up or draw out risky things. And, I just have to deal with that. And I like to joke with them, well, hey guys, you got to die of something. So, so it doesn't bother me. I will kind of let something out there on purpose, because things will emerge. People will come out of the woodwork, as you said, but from my perspective, I'm going to, even if they're bad for me, I'm going to learn something. I'm going to get more data. That happened to me during the
I have learned an incredible amount of stuff from these people.
I'm not surprised.
But they got very upset with me last November, and they threatened me. And 2 of my very good friends were killed right after Christmas.
Yikes. Wow.
So
how did that happen? Was it accidents, or was it
health related? One was tossed off a bridge, and she was a paraplegic, so there's no way she could have done this by suicide. The other one was actually poisoned at work.
At what, at work?
Poisoned at work.
Poisoned.
They had gotten into his lunch and poisoned him. And he rode a bike and he had a heart attack on the way home.
What do you think triggered these actions from the perpetrators? What specifically were you doing, or had you talked about, do you think, that might have been the trigger for these actions?
I was talking about the religious beliefs of certain groups.
Okay.
And I was explaining them on interviews in comparative religion terms.
Which can be very revealing.
And I was comparing them to ancient Judaism. So,
right. Yep.
And they're very like ancient Judaism before the Abrahamic time. The old gods are all pretty much worshipped the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And most folks don't want to consider that the old gods are still being worshipped.
Oh, sure.
In the old ways.
Why would it have stopped, really? There's
no reason for it to have stopped. And they think it was wiped out when Christianity was adopted, but it wasn't. It just went underground.
Yeah. And I think that there's some truth to that also, with what was being done in Mesoamerica with all the sacrifices. Mm-hmm. I don't, and I've heard this from sources that are from down there, okay, that are from the various.
I remember in your bio you've been in South and Central America. And
yeah, they've their response is, it didn't, just what you said, it didn't stop, it just went underground. And some of it was suspected to have emerged. Remember a few years back when the cartels were really active and doing all those acts of terror, chopping people's heads off publicly and all that stuff. The conversations I was having came up because of that. And these things were being said within the context that that's what some of the operatives of these groups were using. In other words, the cartels wanted to send a message. They just, send a message of terror, but the people carrying it out would have been the ones that were likely doing this within the context of sacrifice, actual, ancient
and
sacrificial rites, bloodletting.
Actual sacrifice rituals would have been remembered by the people, and that would have been entirely more terrorizing
Sure.
than simply killing someone.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And, so it's sort of scary. There's still scary stuff out there. I find it interesting, kind of relative to this. I find it interesting that some of your well-known people in ufology just will not talk about the human mutilations. They'll talk about animal mutilations all day long.
Yeah.
They won't talk about the cases of human mutilations that have occurred.
That go right alongside them in many, many, many cases. They're just, you'll find the victims, animal and human together even, and they will only discuss the animal ones. And
always within some type of extraterrestrial or deep state context. They don't want to talk about any other possibilities.
There's no other possibilities, but we both know there are.
No other possibilities, but what?
We both know that there are other possibilities.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's what I thought you said.
Just because something appears to be done by an extraterrestrial doesn't mean it is.
Exactly.
And something that people need to keep in mind is, if there was an extraterrestrial that's being worshipped as an old one, they may not have requested blood sacrifices. It may be simply that their followers decided that's what they needed.
Mm-hmm.
And that will still be the religious dogma.
An interesting book that gets into that is by the aforementioned Joseph Farrell and his sometimes writing partner, Scott DeHart, titled Grid of the Gods. They get into, in that book, and Joseph does in some others, gets into how and possibly why the whole blood sacrifice thing started. And it's in what you said. It was not what was originally intended, and but they went with it. And they discuss it in greater detail and scholarship than I can cover here. But Grid of the Gods, that's a book that talks about that.
That's been something that has bothered me for a long time, because you read the actual documents that go with those faiths, and they're very loving and love your neighbor, but then you watch the rituals that go with them, and it's like, where the hell did they get that?
It's similar, a dynamic of selective discussion with the idea of the threat narrative in the discussion of extraterrestrials. What we have is what Carol Rosin tells us Werner von Braun told her, and people are just taking that and running with it. It's therefore what Werner von Braun said is gospel. There can be no deviation from it. Any discussion.
And Werner von Braun was a Nazi who had used slave labor before the war. And,
exactly.
And yet he's become a saint. How?
Right. And, it's doing where, here's what my interpretation of von Braun is, that what he told Carol Rosin is that these things would be used nefariously for the military industrial complex to gain more power and control with, the globalists and such. But think about it. He says, well, the Cold War's, the first thing that was used. Well, the Cold War was a real thing. He's saying it was used. And then terrorism, That's a real thing. That was not just something, a fake thing that was generated by the military industrial complex to take advantage of. Okay. They use the very real threat of terrorism. They use the very real threat of rogue nations. They're using the very real, I mean, asteroids are real, folks. They can and have slammed into this planet. Okay. They are real. So they use the very real danger. So I don't think he was saying, when he said it's all a lie, he's saying what they were using these threats for. He didn't actually say that there is absolutely no ET threat. So when you look at all these other things that are very real threats, I think it's kind of childish and ignorant to based upon this story of what we're told von Braun said, to just assume, well, you know, nobody out in space means us any harm. They're all a bunch of love and light space angel brothers, and just because they have advanced technology, they have, you know, moved beyond war. Well, that's patently ridiculous. So I don't think it's very
attitude realistic. Is none of them are to be trusted, that they should be treated as used car salesmen, assume they are after something, and find out what it is before you agree to anything.
Just like we would handle any, in the old day, the age of discovery centuries ago, you know, think about it. And in the end of the film Apocalypto is the best dramatized example of this. You know, you have your folks that were here, the, you know, the native peoples that were here, and they had their own stuff going on. And then one day they look and there's this ship and these guys, well, where did they come from? Well, that's really the equivalent of a ship coming from another world. And yeah, like you said, we have to handle it carefully, because we don't know who these people are and what their intentions are. And to assume, all because one person tells us this guy said such and such, to then base your perspective on what's out there, the vast universe, on that's a lot of childish wishful thinking. That's watching Close Encounters and ET too much.
That's one of the things about the entire disclosure movement that drives me crazy, is they want to worship Pleiadians. They want to take every word that's channeled as gospel. They don't even think about that there's V2K from the CIA. You know, synthetic telepathy is a real thing since 1980, guys. Anything channeled since 1980 is probably the CIA.
Well, wasn't the patent for the voice of God technology in the early 60s even? So, my gosh, you know, absolutely. By 1980, imagine how perfected they had made it.
By 1980, it was rolled out on the public, and it's been just gathering steam since.
Right.
So I'm looking at all of these channelers, and I'm going, if you're not, when I'm not on air, I have this ugly little cap that I wear.
It's invisible. Oh, there we go.
There we go. It's from lessemf.com. Yes, I'm giving them advertising. It's what they call a brain cap, and it's nylon net with nickel embedded in it.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
So it's an EMF blocker.
And it's more stylish than the foil thing, like in Signs. Remember the foil?
What is it? Control Factor, the movie, was about V2K. And they tell you in the movie how to stop it. You produce your own Faraday cage. Well, that's what this is.
Right, okay, I've heard this.
My own Faraday cage.
There you go.
So
there you go.
If you're doing channeling and you're not wearing a Faraday cage, I'm not going to listen. Because you're listening to the CIA. And if I want to listen to the CIA, all I got to do is keep the cap off.
Yeah. Well, and then setting aside the known technology that we're talking about, okay, let's say it's not some type of Earth-based technological source. Let's say you are channeling something from some other dimension or out there or whatever, then again, you have to ask yourself, who really is this? What really is this that's communicating with me? Because it could tell you anything. Oh, yeah, I'm Zebwob from Ganymede. Yeah, trust me.
Exactly.
And these
but
people,
I'm not
they
even going to
love
listen
and light.
in the first place if they're not wearing a Faraday cage. Because if they're not wearing a Faraday cage, it's the CIA.
Very, very possibly, yeah. Very possibly. So,
and that's another one of my things that piss people off. But it is what it is. I'm tired of people not using their brain.
well, it's more fun to and easier to sleep at night for a lot of people to just go ahead and embrace that everything's wonderful, everything's love and light, and anybody who tells us otherwise about these things is part of the disinformation, evil group, and it's, you can't win with these people. All you can do
it's a religious belief.
Yeah,
it's to the point where that you are dealing with dogma, and they cannot think because dogma replaces thought.
Right.
And it's just yeah, I know. For me to come from the community that I do and talk this way.
Oh, I catch hell too, because I've had a couple of folks that are.
Oh, I had science training.
I've had a couple of folks who are, and I don't mean this in a bad way, they're from the new age demographic who have stopped watching my live stream because I certainly have embraced, and I don't like to use the word believe, but for simplicity's sake, you get what I mean, but it's not a hollow-eyed belief when I say, I believe these things are real, but at the same time, I'm also going to be honest with my critical opinions about some of the things people claim and some of the very people who are claiming them. You have to, because we've had so many frauds.
I'm not going to embrace everybody out there,
right?
Because there are too many frauds, too many people that watched a video and had a dream and think that they're part of that group because they dreamt about them. And there's some psychic out there that told them, oh, you had a past life as such and such. And I'm like, if it doesn't make sense in 3D, it's not real. And I get in trouble all the time for that one.
Speaking of dreams, we're talking about dreams, and you went into this a little bit earlier. I agree with you. A lot of dreams are just your subconscious processing through things, very importantly, and very important things. But I do very much think that there's something very real about precognitive dreams. I've had this experience once,
or flashbacks.
It was like 40 years ago, and it was a doozy that the parts of this dream came true over the course of 20 some years. It was mind-boggling.
I have one of those that plays on a loop, and I will literally, it's a 5-part loop, and I will literally have this recur all the time.
Sure. Yeah.
And I can tell you almost every detail of the loop. And it's the story of how the pole flip will operate. And I sincerely hope I am not on the timeline it happens to. And all of these people who keep telling me, oh, we're going to ascend and we're going to leave Earth. And I'm like, you haven't had the nightmares that I've had, or you would know better. So
I keep returning to, particularly the last few years, over the course of years, but the last few years, it's much more often. There is a particular landscape in I call it a city, but this particular place I keep returning to. I go there often. It has the same type of architecture It and oh my gosh, I love the dreams that are really lucid and vivid, right? And this is very, very lucid and vivid, but
Do you
what's
know
interesting
what
is
it
I
is?
keep returning to that same place, and I have a friend um, that I talk with about stuff. She's a Jungian scholar,
Okay.
and so we have interesting discussions. But what prompted me to talk about this with her is I have not had nightmares. I don't have traditional nightmares, but I experienced what's called oneirophobia lately, and it's the fear of dreaming. Not because I have nightmares, but because my dreams are so vivid and so realistic, and can be. I don't have nightmares, but I have intense, frustration experiences like we all do in dreams, and it's so real that it's almost exhausting. And I kind of long for just a night of dreamless sleep, because
Okay.
I know that the dreamland and experience is going to be so intense that I almost have a hard time falling asleep because of that.
When my memories were activated in 2013, I went through, I didn't sleep at all. I was lucid 24/7, and I would I would lay down, and Lou would tell me I had been asleep, but I didn't remember being asleep.
Mm-hmm.
And it was I wasn't here. Um, that's the best way to describe it. I wasn't here. I was interacting with beings best described as interdimensionals,
Mm-hmm.
and it was like this all the time, day or night. It was 3 years of that, and I was seriously suicidal because I just, it was so intense and unrelenting. And
And
finally,
your mind wasn't able to truly rest and
yeah,
recuperate from the dream experience, and that I'm sure that was
yeah.
just making think your waking life hell.
Um, I would, I would be sitting and tears running down my face
Mm-hmm.
all the time. And while I was trying to process this big lump of memories that were all in German
Mm-hmm.
and figure out what the fuck was I remembering?
Ah,
And
sure.
was it real? Was it what? And so I've read everything I could get my hands on. And I've met some of the authors or speakers that
Mm-hmm.
helped me the most. And surprisingly, they've been the nastiest.
Really?
Really, the ones that their work helped me the most have been the nastiest in person. And
Wow. You think it's an ego thing on their part primarily?
I think it's what happened to me is so far beyond their worldview that it's impossible for them to accept it.
And therefore, yes, that answers my question. It is an ego bruise on their part. They don't like that. They don't like that. I hear you.
Um, it, my family is Church of Christ. And when I lived in Riverside, I went to I can't remember the name of the street it was on, but it was the Church of Christ that's shaped like a whale from the top. Um, there's a lot of weird architecture in Riverside, but that
Was it downtown, or was it like in Arlington, or uh, uh, like what part of town?
I think it was in Arlington, but I didn't live in the good part of town. I lived up north, and
Okay.
near, at the time it was near UC Riverside.
Casablanca.
So
Sounds like you were near Casablanca, and that's not. You're right. That's not one of the better parts of Riverside.
I have never lived in the good part of town.
Mm.
So, I speak enough Spanish to get by. I walk into a neighborhood, act like I own the joint, and everybody puts up with me.
Casablanca is part of the area adjacent to the area that I talk about in the books where I first encountered, where I was first overtly introduced to Hecate in that rose garden at the Citrus History Park before discovering the quarry, the mysterious quarry. She led me to the quarry. And that's the part of town that stuff is all in, right north of Victoria.
Yeah. There was a canal that at that time was
the Gage Canal,
dirt bank. And my neighbor, who was from India, decided that my kids have a genetic disease, so he decided that he was going to be a good eugenic and kill my kid. And in the process, he decided to kill my cat. I had a Himalayan. And so he dumped the cat into the canal, and it came back covered with like this much of red clay.
Oh my gosh.
I bathed the cat before it had a chance to set, and he ended up okay. But we had issues with this person for a while, and he ended up falsely accusing my husband of some stuff. And we ended up at the courthouse where I was introduced to Hecate on the roof, except I thought she was Pallas Athena because of the way that she was carved.
Well, yeah, she looks very much Grecian. She does look like Pallas Athena, but that wheel at her feet and those other two female figures are the giveaway, right?
Yeah, well, I know this now, but I didn't then.
Right.
I've done most of my occult study since the memories were brought back, because the context of parts of the memory were so obviously occult. So I have abilities that there's no other explanation for them, no other rational explanation for them. And you know that I'm grasping for straws when occult is the rational explanation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah. And those folks that contacted me after my tree got to the point where certain people were in it, one of them told me flat out, he says, "You're really smart, but you've obviously been to public school and you have a lot of gaps in your information." He says, "And I like you, so I'm going to teach you." And so every couple of months, he gives me a book list. And that has made a major difference in my worldview and explained a whole hell of a lot of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And I learned without having to accept their religion. So I have learned of their faith without being part of it, studying it as an academic pursuit rather than a faith thing.
Right.
So I've had folks, "Well, you know about this, so you must be demonic." Well, not exactly.
Yeah, it can get kind of contentiously nutty out there with some folks that are trapped in their dogma.
Yeah. It's like, if you see any other part of the world other than their dogma,
right,
you're a threat because you see other than their dogma.
Yeah.
So
you're disregarding their filter, and that's what offends them. That's what scares them, because the filter is what they're clinging to for their feeling of security and I would dare say their sanity. And when they encounter people that don't particularly find their filter to be as compelling as they do, well, they're the kind of folks that it scares them, because I would say that the particular faith that they think they're so strong in, they're actually not that strong with. That faith is not that strong because it's hanging so tenuously by a thread. That's why they're clinging to it. It can't withstand the existence of other people who just simply don't see it their way. Whereas I think a true faith is something that can withstand disagreement, because you understand the nature of your faith and your faith filters, and you're comfortable with it. They're not.
Believe something, you can sit in the middle of people who disagree with you without ever batting an eye.
Yeah.
My family, oh my God, those people, they're still Church of Christ after all these years. And they disowned me because I became Episcopalian. And yet, yes, I know how that plays in your books. I was a lay reader and a priest assistant, 6 years. And I was finally excommunicated because they had done 104 exorcisms on me, and I still had altars.
Wow.
So if I had known at the get-go that that was what they were trying to get rid of, I would have told them to stop wasting their time. Altars are scars from traumas. They're not demons. So,
yeah.
But life is what it is, you know? Once you've had shit happen, you're stuck with what you are afterwards. You can do your best to make the best of it, but if you're damaged, you're going to be damaged until it heals.
Right.
So, anyway.
And you know, the experience of healing that damage and responding to that damage and getting a perspective on that damage is, in my opinion, in my experience, really one of the main reasons why we're here in this human existence. Is that classic age-old thing that suffering is part of the deal, is part of the reason we agree that it is kind of an agreement. It's like, yeah, you know, go down in that human existence or out into that human existence in this human physical realm, this experiencing the dings and the sufferings, yeah, every bit of a part of it, because you learn, you know, this sounds like cliches, but it's cliches for a reason. You do learn through it. You do grow in ways through it. And it's a very real experience that until you go through it, you find it hard to believe when folks like us are talking about it. They're saying, well, they're just middle-aged people, you know, and it's like,
no,
well,
no. I'm 65. I'm an old fart.
there's, you know, but yeah, you might. Here's the thing. That's the funny thing about, you know, you get into that big middle-aged to older zone, and yes, that's when certain things start happening to you. And there's a reason why in certain traditions, Kabbalah being one of them, you were not allowed to even approach the study of it until you reached 40 years old, for example. Why? That's because the 40-year-old human mind, men and women that, you know, you reach 40, there's certain things going on in the psyche and connected with the interdimensional and stuff that have not matured until you get to that point in life. So you can't really interpret them properly, or, you know, comprehend them properly when you're younger. You just literally cannot do it. And this is one of the reasons why
the rabbi said that you had to be a married man past 40 because people literally went insane.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. If you attempted it, you attempted it. But and I was going to say, it's the reason why I despise ageism and, you know, this youth worship. I'm sorry, but I just, a 20-year-old, there's so many reasons that, you know, the wisdom of a 20-year-old We were all 20-year-olds, at one time, but the difference between now and me then, was I remember
did a lot of really, really foolish things when I was 20.
Yeah. I remember when I was 20, I knew I was only 20. Okay. I had my things I was confident in, but I also was smart enough to go, hey, I can learn something from, older folks. Come on, I'm only 20 years old. They've forgotten, half of, what I already, what I know. They've forgotten half of what they, know more than I've learned. And, so that's when I see this whole thing with ageism. And when I see, the young folks that are pumped up, you're so wonderful, you're so perfect, you're the greatest thing. I'm like, oh boy, are they being set up for a crash and a fall. Somebody make the popcorn. I want to sit in the stands and watch all these 20 somethings as they go smash into the brick wall of life and reality. Because why? Not because I want to see them destroyed or crushed.
Every one of them.
Yeah, I want to, I then, because at that point, when that happens to them, then is when they really begin to learn. And then is when you can be there to help them back up. And then when they really become who they really are, and that's when the wisdom can begin. So that's one of the reasons why I very humorously encourage them slamming into that brick wall of life, because I know that's really the first step. When all their BS self-confidence, they're so wonderful as a young person, shatters, that's when they can really begin to learn and advance and grow and become, as Indiana Jones' father says in the Last Crusade, that's when they can actually start becoming interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
When they're 19 or 20, I'm sorry, you're not that interesting to the advanced, enlightened mind. Okay. You're not that interesting yet. Down the road, you would definitely
I tell them, well, you have potential. You have potential. I'll listen. I may laugh at you, but
yeah, I'm gonna laugh at them. I am gonna point out when they they step on themselves, as we say. There's a phrase when they step on their thing, that I learned in the military, when you screw up. Oh
yes,
yeah, and that's only because it's good for their growth. I learned that from my dad and from my mentor that I had. We learn that you learn the best lessons from your screw ups, and when you have a mentor pointing them out to you and having a good laugh about them, to be able to laugh about your screw ups. That's the beginning of learning.
My tutor, he just sort of, he's very young. I was surprised by his maturity. When I met him, he was 18. And he's only barely 30 now. But he's had a maturity all along that most people don't have until their 60s. And he does some regular fuck ups in his regular life. But talking with him, he has an understanding of things that isn't common. And so I really appreciated that he was willing to spend the time with me. And his father has retired, and he's taken over the family business. And so he doesn't have a lot of time anymore. So it's like twice a year, he'll send me this long list of books. Mm-hmm. And one of them was a grimoire about the clip cloth.
About what?
The clip cloth. The roots of the tree of life.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And I wrote back to him and I go, it says there's a curse on you if you're not going to worship these beings, but you read it. And I go, I'm not going to worship them. He says, read it anyway. So that's a very interesting book, but if you take curses seriously, don't read it.
Now, what book is this?
The Citra Atra.
Okay, yeah, I was sent a book which is of more modern authorship, into old things. I don't want to mention the title, but I was sent to it by a friend, associate, a gentleman who used to be an engineer and is retired now. And we have some very fascinating private conversations. And he sent me this book that involved, I guess, what you would call, Enochian type magic. And it states from the beginning that it is coming from the dark side, of this kind of ancient magic. And it definitely it's a book that I treat very carefully. I will admit, I do not keep it in the room where I sleep. I keep it on another shelf in another room. And
I understand that.
Yeah, I treat it as among those books I have that I don't, I'm careful.
I'm not Christian anymore, but I have books that I will stack my Bible on top of it.
For good measure.
For good measure.
But,
yes. Just because I no longer believe that Jesus is God, I believe these guys are real.
Yeah.
I do. I just don't believe they're gods.
Well, my view of that is there's who and what Christ actually is. And then there's, this God figure. I do not think that the God figure that Christ talks about is the God of the Old Testament. I think the Yahweh is this character who, assumed and who convinced all these folks that he was a God, and because it just, to me, I'm one of those that doesn't think the very personality of the being that Christ talks about and this being in the Old Testament are even the same figure. So
they don't match up at all.
Right. Yeah. And anyway, my view of Christ, what and who he actually is, from my perspective, resonates with the lore that we have about how this whole thing existed before Christianity, before Judaism, but going back to the days of Mithras and all that. To me, that doesn't, I'm just speaking for myself, that doesn't for me disprove Christ. All that does is makes me understand who this figure actually is, and that he did not start or originate with what we know as Christianity. Because what we know as Christianity, a lot of that is a construct. I mean, yikes.
Yeah. I had reached the point where, because of the construct and because of the obvious solar worship parts, that I had decided that the actual man of Jesus Christ had not even existed, that he was made up by the Flavian emperors when they had Jesus at their house, and that this was where I was. And my tutor said, no, he's part of the Grail line, and he matters because he was an anointed king in the line. And he said that what he was trying to do was unite the Judaism of his day with the Alexandrian mystery schools to bring the divine feminine back into,
I could see that. Yeah.
Back into their lives.
I could see that.
And that's why he was killed, was because the Jewish hierarchy at the time did not want the divine feminine.
Yeah. See, I think for me, it's this Jesus figure was a real guy who lived, and a lot of this other stuff we're talking about was applied to his biography, so to speak, so that you had this real guy, you had this lore and stuff, you combine them, and then you have this third thing. Isn't that interesting how it's kind of a trinity in itself? You have this third thing that is, as that one pope said centuries ago, this myth of Christ, which has served them well.
It has.
Don't even get me started on the Roman Catholic Church. I spend
we don't have time to get you started
exactly
on that.
Right?
There is another show that starts in 4 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I know. We can't, that would take 4 months to have that discussion.
But
So.
if you want to come back, I'd be happy to have it.
Sure. Yeah, yeah,
All right.
absolutely. Because we got all sorts of stuff to talk about. So I'm glad
I'd love that.
I would love to.
Okay. I'll schedule you in Messenger.
Okay,
So,
great. I look forward to it.
okay. Since we've only got a few minutes left, plug your stuff shamelessly.
Okay. My books can only be found at lulu.com at my publisher page. Remember, Lulu is not a publisher. They are just a printer distributor. I'm the publisher of my particular company, but only at Lulu. The reason you don't find my stuff on Amazon is because Amazon is not good for small press publishers and indie authors. So I don't do with Amazon. Print on demand, it takes you a few days to get it, but it's great product. I'm also at the Walter Bosley channel at YouTube. And you can find me in the usual social media places, Facebook, Instagram, or whatever. And I look forward to seeing you out there at the I do a live stream every Sunday at 5:30 p.m. Pacific time. So I look forward to seeing your folks join us